Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I had our weekly chat on geopolitics and markets. We were feeling quite introspective, so you guys seem to like those episodes where we're thinking about thinking, so hopefully you'll like this one. Email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or want to hear more about what we do at CI. Otherwise, cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Rob, I feel like every week you and I are always running around like chickens with our heads cut off and doing lots of things, but this week feels particularly busy for me. Do you feel the same way?
Well, I'm usually trying to pull my head out of whatever rabbit hole I've gone down into to prepare for doing these conversations. But sometimes it's harder than others, that's for sure.
Well, in the meantime, I see you made it to your co-working space despite the fact that the French people are protesting in mass about having to work till the age of 64.
Well, it's true. The whole city is shut down. I mean, no one's going to work unless you can walk to work like me, thankfully. But it's funny, the stoicism with which most people take it, I guess, because they're just used to it.
Yeah, I feel like every time I have visited Paris, which is like, I guess 3 or 4 times in my lifetime, there has always been a protest at some point somewhere in the city. I don't know if that's just about timing or what, but the French do seem to like to blow off a little steam.
Well, that's for sure. Blow off steam with a brick being thrown here and there usually is how it works.
Lovely. Well, let's not get caught too far down that rabbit hole. Before we do anything, Rob, I think you should take a victory lap on the Bank of Japan, which came out with its monetary policy statement. Everybody thought that they were going to blink at yield curve control. They did not. So maybe just take a 2-minute explanation of what people thought was going on and why you were ahead of the curve in saying that it wasn't going to happen the way the market was at least positioning a little bit for.
Well, I don't know if victory lap is the right term because the yen is pretty much where it was a week ago. So despite a bit of a weakening after this, it's not made any huge move. But just to remind the listeners, the setup here was that the speculation is that the Bank of Japan is going to have to alter its yield curve control policy, that inflation is getting too high in Japan, that the mechanism of the policy is breaking down because bond yields want to be higher than the Bank of Japan wants to let them be. So the market is not functioning. There's no demand for bonds at these prices. So the bank is having to buy all the bonds and basically keep that market functioning. So a lot of people are long the yen and they're short Japanese bonds because they think that this is not sustainable. And that's really the open question, is how much determination does the Bank of Japan have to keep this going? And a lot of people think that, this is just a temporary delay, that Kuroda is setting the table for his eventual successor, who will be named in the spring, to normalize policy and sort of reflect these changes that have taken place. And I'm pretty skeptical of that. I don't think that they're going to be nearly as quick to change as people assume, either him or his successor. And that's what did in fact sort of play out, at least in this meeting, where there was a lot of speculation that they were going to make some meaningful change or at least signal, and they did nothing. So far so good for our thesis.
So far so good. And I mean, this kind of backs into what you were saying about how you feel like the general narrative right now is still China reopening and things like that. But when you look at inflation data around the world, seems to have crested in the UK, seems to have crested a little bit in the United States. Like if the concern is about rising inflation in Japan as part of sort of a global rise in inflation, I mean, it seems like the rest of the world is actually starting to pivot away from that. But I mean, China still seems like the center of that pivot too. It seems like people are trying to figure out if the China reopening is going to give a shot in the arm to global commodities and global equities. And there's a lot of uncertainty there too. I don't really, it's hard to read it one way or another. I find myself sort of on the fence and unable to see which direction it's going.
Yeah, it's funny in markets and how tied they are to narrative cycles, so to speak. So I would say that right now we're near the end of a narrative and the market's kind of looking for a new narrative. And the narrative that we just sort of exhausted is this Chinese reopening commodity, emerging market long narrative. Short the dollar, long foreign currencies, long commodities, long Chinese stocks. And in your interview with Alf and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on
Andreas.
Andreas on Monday. I think both of them mentioned we've been riding this theme, but we're not sure how long this is going to continue. And I think that's correct. Is we're sort of in the tail end of this story, which has been going on since the autumn, and now the question is, does this have legs? Is a new narrative going to take form? And it's a very interesting time to watch markets because markets are, tend to trend in one direction or another. And now a lot of these assets, Chinese equities, the euro, the dollar against a lot of different pairs, base metals, they're sort of extended and they're sputtering a little bit. So the question is, are they going to digest the gains they've made and be off to the races again? Or is this going to sort of exhaust itself and all of this expectation about Chinese growth and reopening is going to fall short of expectations and you get, a pivot back in the other direction? That's TBD.
Although I'm a little worried that I think the U.S., did it hit the debt ceiling today? But the Treasury Department says, oh, don't worry, we have all these extraordinary things we can do for the next 5 months. But if the Republicans, if we can't get an agreement with the Republicans by June, then we're really we're in danger of default and stuff like that. I have this sort of resigned sense that for the next 5 months, the narrative is literally just going to be about the debt ceiling and squabbling in the House of Representatives, which I'm not really particularly looking forward to. I hope I'm wrong about that.
Well, it could very well be. And it's funny the way that it works, though, because people assume markets are so smart with these things. I read an article today that was saying, why aren't markets pricing in, sort of general artificial intelligence and its emergence is going to raise real interest rates because we'll be living in this age of abundance. Why isn't the market pricing that in yet? And I was thinking, the market isn't even pricing in the fact that we could, have the debt ceiling be breached and default next month, never mind, these big binary things. But even very short-term issues, people are paying attention to it, but I don't think they're really paying attention to it right now as a real thing that could happen with consequences. Certainly it's not in prices. So that could come up real quick.
Yeah, there's also a divide here between the United States and the rest of the world, which is we'll see if I don't know. I don't want to step on the segue here. It might be too soon to bring this up. But I remember once George told me this story where he was talking to somebody in Azerbaijan who desperately wanted to know what is the U.S. government position on Nagorno-Karabakh and what does the U.S. population think about Nagorno-Karabakh. And George's answer, I think, was the right answer, which is nobody in the United States knows what the fuck Nagorno-Karabakh is. Nobody gives a damn. Maybe there's some lobbying organization somewhere that's giving some money to a congressman who's willing to say something about it. But if you think that the U.S. population is sitting here looking at the blocking of a Armenian corridor to Nagorno-Karabakh and paying, even aware that it exists, they probably think Nagorno-Karabakh is like a dwarvish kingdom and in the new Tolkien series on Amazon or something like that. The world thinks that we're all paying attention to these things, and really we're just watching the next Kardashian show.
Yeah, and it's funny the way that that's changed over the years, though, is because when I was first starting my career, I think there was still the perception that you could get an informational edge in markets, that you can find information that other people don't have and exploit it. And that's kind of how the investment business has been organized for a very long time. Hedge funds trying to get the next source of alternative data. And, we have the credit card scanner data, and that's going to show us, how much money people are spending at Dunkin' Donuts this month before they report the quarterly numbers. And it's just really in the last 10 years that I think it's become so apparent that really doesn't confer an edge. Like, the information is so abundant that the edge is in what do you pay attention to? And that's a much more subtle and difficult thing to optimize.
Yeah, that's true in markets. It's true in intelligence. It's true in research. It's true in just about everything. And it might be one of the reasons people are so enamored of AI, because AI offers the promise of, something that can sort through a morass of data really fast and try and point your direction to the things that are actually important. But I agree with you. I mean, the job of like an intelligence organization 30, 40 years ago was, James Bond, put on the tuxedo, find the secret piece of information that, connects the whole puzzle and you can figure out what's going on going forward. Whereas, now, it was already sort of this way once you had fax machines and copies and microfilm and all that other kind of stuff. But now that just everything is on the web, it's just a deluge of information. I was in Denver earlier this week, and somebody asked me like what my process was and how I start my days. And it's like, if I have nothing else going on, like I spend 4 hours in the morning just trying to get through like the main papers that I think are important and trying to suss out what's real and what's not. I think it's also why, this is something we used to talk about a lot at Stratfor, which is you sort of need a combination of young and old minds on the same team if you're going to exist in this information ecosystem, because the older you are, the more experience you have, and the more you can sort of read through the lines in something and say, oh, this is important, this is not. But the older you are, also the less malleable your brain is. And with the amount of information that's coming through, you really do need young people who can cram 50 things into their brain and like bring them to you and sort of like watch the connections between them, because the information flow is so big that those people who have the decades of experience can't even really find the things that they need to find because they can't sort through kind of the morass.
Man, the other thing I've noticed with older analysts is there's a tendency, after you've seen a pattern repeat over and over again, to be a little bit lazy with your mental models on how you interpret things. And I've experienced that in the past where I've been interacting with an older analyst and they say, oh, here's this company, here's the short setup, or here's the story. They say, oh, I've seen this 3 times before, it's XYZ. And you lose that sort of flexibility to be coming at things a little bit more fresh and new, and to entertain more possibilities.
Well, it's something, not to be too introspective here, but it's actually something I worry about in the same way that, like, a basketball player's prime is from 20 to 35. And after that, they really can't play basketball anymore. I find that with analysts, like, your prime is like 35 to 50, maybe 55 if you take good care of yourself, because before 35, you don't really know shit. And then after 55, you can't really keep up, even if you're really diligent about challenging your own mental models. Like, your brain just slows down a little bit. You can't retain as much as you used to, or be as flexible as before. And this is true in a lot of different industries, I'm sure. But like, if you were really like a geopolitical analyst or an intelligence analyst, maybe you feel this way about an investment analyst. I feel like they should be like, you should be paying the most to the 35 to 55-year-old, and then like down, like on either side of the barbell, like kind of downplaying it. But that's not the way it works, right? In a lot of companies, the older you are, it's linear, raises over long periods of time. And in that way, you kind of, you don't incentivize the people who are in their prime to do the work that they're sort of ready to do. I guess I'm also thinking of this a little bit subconsciously. I'm sure you saw the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, resigned. And her reason was she just didn't have enough in the tank to do another term as Prime Minister. And whatever you think about her politics, I know some people find her controversial because of how intense New Zealand's COVID-19 lockdowns were. That was so refreshing. There are some octogenarians in various stages of the U.S. government who could learn a thing or two about maybe taking a step back because they don't have the same energy in the tank that they used to do the governing of an entire nation. So I don't know. Maybe that's why that's on my mind. I'm rambling now.
No, but it's, I think it underlines how important it is to do things in a sustainable way. I used to know these guys, these super, super smart hedge fund guys who worked in the tiger complex. And, the guy was a Rhodes Scholar, just absolutely incredible. And they started their own hedge fund. They came out of the gates, just absolutely blasting, working 16-hour days up at 3 a.m. And then they were starting to get into all these sort of crazy esoteric things that were not in their wheelhouse, like trading gold volatility and just crazy stuff like that. And they burned out. Like, they had a very good run. They didn't blow up or anything, but they just burned out. And they only lasted like 3, 4, 5 years, and then they just left the business because they didn't manage themselves. They managed everything but themselves.
Well, that was a good tangent, but to sort of close the loop there, I don't know what to think about this yet, but it ties to the China reopening thing that we started this tangent with, which is there are a couple of reports in China this week that caught my attention. Two in particular. One was that there was a media report that China wants basically they want to curtail processing capacity for corn-based ethanol fuel to ensure that China has enough corn to meet agricultural demand and to reduce reliance on external sources. And then there was also another one, which wasn't just a report. This was China's agriculture ministry actually telling farmers and local governments to cut back on soybean meal in animal feed to reduce imports. And I'll try not to get too nerdy with why this is interesting, but the first on the corn issue, China used to, still does, imports a lot of corn from the United States, but recently approved Brazilian corn for import. And this might have been the year where you were going to see China pivot to Brazil in sort of a major way. You've also got China, which I don't think is secure from an energy perspective at all right now. You have apparently Turkmenistan is cutting off natural gas exports due to a really cold winter there. We saw that China did an about face last week on importing coal, and now they want to get rid of biofuels in general. So there's sort of this, do you want energy independence and security? Do you want food security? Who do you want to import from? There's that question. And then the soybean meal question in animal feed is interesting for two reasons. The first is, if you're going to get this renewable diesel uptick that we've talked about on the podcast before, like when you crush soybeans, you get soybean meal, soybean oil. The oil is what you use to create renewable diesel and biofuels. The meal is what's fed to animals to sort of fatten them up and things like that. So the idea is you're going to have this huge surplus of soybean meal on the market. And in the past, like, China's been a place where all that excess is going to go to because they're rebuilding their hog industry, or they're trying to, grow more meat at home sort of thing. And if they're saying they don't want to import soybean meal, already you were sort of looking, I think, at a collapse in the price of soybean meal. So if China's not going to import, that's already interesting in and of its own right, and how that connects to the renewable diesel story. And then the second part is, they said that that one of the reasons behind it was they wanted to pivot to, different sources of protein, even some that were created in laboratories, like different sort of feeds that, Chinese tech companies or Chinese feed companies were going to create, so that they didn't have to import these things from abroad. Those were just really interesting. I didn't quite know what to do with it. And then the real cherry on top to make my confusion even more, to leave me even more befuddled, was that China's National Bureau of Statistics said that China had a bumper harvest this past year in 2022, which makes no sense because literally 2 months ago they were talking about how it was the worst heat wave in like 30 years in all the places that grow these important grains. So I don't really know what to make of all that, but if you're thinking about China and reopening and how that fits into the market narrative, you have China at least like suggesting that it wants to import a lot less of sort of the major commodities that it's been the main market mover for over the past couple of years. And that, I don't know, I don't quite know what to do with that, but I keep on running back into soybeans and corn and biofuels and renewable diesel and just about any story that I get to right now.
Can you provide some context around that? So tell us a little bit about, China's history in terms of self-sufficiency, its desire to reduce its reliance on food exports, and just how does this tie into the history of these developments?
Yeah, so really briefly, so Chairman Mao, one of his biggest things was he wanted to make China self-sufficient in grain production. Famously, he tried to, he had this big plan for how it was going to happen. All the local officials weren't willing to tell him that the plan was terrible and wasn't going very well. And you get a huge famine that kills millions of people in China in sort of the late 1950s. But over time, China's actually done a really good job at increasing grain production, even though it has a limited amount of arable land relative to its massive population. But especially in sort of the last 15 to 20 years, I mean, China is, and you can say this for almost any commodity, whether it's steel or iron ore or oil. I mean, like China's imports of these things are surging because the Chinese economy has surged. But China imports lots of corn, lots of soybeans. If you're a farmer in the United States, like, exporting to China might not have been the thing that might not have even been your biggest client, but like that was where you were going to probably make the most money. Like farmers were thinking, oh my God, like this huge market, like the old McKinsey line, like China's middle class is going to be bigger than the entire population of the United States. You had all these farmers and miners and even like tech companies who were like, oh, we're going to sell to these 500 million Chinese middle class people. And it just feels like that's teetering a little bit. Like China doesn't want the tech companies to have access to the Chinese domestic market. They want to have a domestic aerospace champion rather than buying all their planes from Airbus and Boeing. They don't want to buy soybeans and corn from the United States. They don't want the United States to be able to use that as a cudgel in trade kind of relations and negotiations. So it's all part of, China has benefited immensely from globalization and can't turn its back on globalization. But when you get down to the things that actually make society move, food, energy, China wants to be more self-sufficient than it is. And it's done well in some areas. And in some areas, it's just, they're really harsh constraints for China. Like China can't really produce all of the wheat and all of the corn and all of the soybeans and all of the rice that it needs. It sort of has to pick and choose which grains it's going to do and then import from abroad. And then complicating all of this is that and this is true in everything too, and this is true of all governments. I don't mean to just call out China for this, but their statistics leave a lot to be desired. So are they really importing as much as they say? How much do they actually have in storage versus what is actually on the market? Like all that stuff is really hard to parse. But that's sort of the broader thing here about China and importing from the world and whether reopening actually means what it's going to mean and the steps that China's going to take or that it can't take to try and, be more self-sufficient and independent when it comes to these things.
It's worth keeping all that in mind when you consider how aggressively they're building out capacity in things like solar PV cells and solar deployment and, battery electric vehicles. We speak about this in the context of, China is just technologically advanced. They're beating us to these things, but there's a big security element to these things too, because it's reducing your reliance on certain commodities by design. So there's a reaching for the future, but also a big element of fear in some of these build-outs, I would say.
There is, and one of the reasons, and not to drone on this too much, but like one of the reasons these particular reports caught my attention so much is because Brazil is there as an alternative. Like Brazil's going to have massive corn and soybean crops this year. Brazil has stated that it wants to become a wheat exporter. I saw a report, I think Brazilian rice exports still fairly small, but increased by something like 82% year on year. Like Brazil has sort of bet on being like the non-American, more pragmatic, middle of the road supplier of Chinese appetites. And you would think that China would have a little more faith in its ability to access Brazilian market. So just the fact that China was, thinking, maybe access to Brazil is not so good. Maybe we need to figure things out a little bit differently. That also kind of struck me in general.
Do you think that says anything about Brazil and how it's perceived to be ultimately within the U.S. orbit?
Well, it's also a long way away. It's a long way away. Even if it was on the Pacific, it would probably be a hard sell because of how far away it is. But this is the good thing and the bad thing about South America. It's far away from the rest of the world, so it's hard to get to markets and it takes a long time. But the good thing is also it's far away from the rest of the world. Look at Eurasia right now. I mean, it's just what a mess from China all the way to Europe. Like it's just like one continuous belt of like varying degrees of either political instability or outright violence.
And sticking to Southeast Asia, can you explain, because I don't think a lot of people have a lot of background in this, what's happening in Vietnam and why should we care?
I'll try. I mean, so Vietnam is one of those countries where those who speak don't know and those who know don't speak sort of dynamic. It's not quite as much of a black box as a place like North Korea or Iran, for example, but it's very, very hard to get good information out of Vietnam and what's going on. If you zoom back, Vietnam, like China, is at least in form, a communist country. And so they have these 5-year transitions and different political cycles where they choose who's going to lead, and it's all very carefully choreographed over time. China obviously threw that out with Xi Jinping, who has usurped all of those things, and now he's just going to be emperor forever. Vietnam doesn't necessarily have their emperor yet, but that system has sort of broken down, and the different political factions that, sort of in the north, you have North Vietnam and South Vietnam, like the hangover of the Vietnam War is still there. So you've got, this faction gets this position, this faction gets that position. It's a sort of consensus-driven model, and you move forward. That's very, very simplistic, but for those that think about Vietnam, think about it that sort of way. So at the last leadership transition in Vietnam, they didn't actually pick a new slate of leaders or a new leader. They just kind of stuck with what was there before. And that was telling you that something was going on behind the scenes, that there isn't agreement between the political factions about what's going to happen going forward. And then this week, we saw that Vietnam's parliament held an emergency session, basically, and kicked the president, whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. I think it's Win. Well, I'm not even going to pronounce. I know it's Win is probably the first one, but the other two I'm not even going to attempt. Sorry, Vietnamese listeners, all three of you. So they decided to usher the president out. Which again, we don't like nominally that was because he oversaw a bunch of corruption, and it seems like the Vietnamese government is having its own little crackdown on corruption. This president was also very pro-business reforms and connecting Vietnam to global supply chains and things like that. So is this an example of Vietnam also turning inward? Are they going to be less friendly to foreign businesses now going forward? Is it just political infighting? Like, all of that is very opaque. I don't know, and I'm trying my best to find out what's going on. But like I said, it's a hard country to get in behind the scenes. But I think the reason that it's important is because a lot of U.S. companies that were moving out of China, Vietnam was sort of, the place that you wanted to be. And a lot of those companies were feeling very good that bet on Vietnam in a big way. But I've sort of been talking for a while now that, political risk in Vietnam is really hard to gauge. Infrastructure has kind of really can't keep up with the amount of interest that there is in Vietnam. And in some ways, if you're trying to diversify from like a supply chain perspective, Vietnam is still in like the Asia Pacific. It's still on the South China Sea. Like, it's not exactly the panacea that it's going to be. So for companies that bet on Vietnam, I wouldn't say this is like run for the hills right now. But clients that I have that I'm working with, like I sent this to them immediately, and they're they know from me that like, hey, like Vietnam is a place where things are uncertain, and like when you start to see these types of things bubbling up on the surface, that probably means there's a lot going on behind the scenes that you should be worried about.
And what would you say are sort of the geopolitical imperatives of Vietnam? If it's so opaque, the politics, the jockeying behind the scenes, what is the constraints that unifies a lot of these guys when you think about analyzing where the country is likely to go?
That's a good question, and makes me think I should really sit down and do more of a proper net assessment on Vietnam. But, Vietnam is sort of has any of the constraints that any of those Asian countries wants. It wanted to become like one of the next Asian tiger miracles. We talk about how we went from Japan to Korea to Taiwan to China. Like, I think Vietnam wanted to be sort of one of the next stepping stones in that chain. But like China, Vietnam has it's a communist system. Like the side that the United States supported in the Vietnam War did not win. So like you have a country that is really communist in form, and that is, the Vietnam War was not that long ago. And the Vietnam War was not just the U.S. messing around in Vietnam. It was really a civil war inside of Vietnam itself. And, there's already differences between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and how that, from a factional and political and ideological perspective, all that stuff is operative. So you've got a Vietnamese government that's trying to keep the fragile balance that's been in place since the North won the war. And also trying to participate in the global economy and not turn into like a North Korea style state, but try and emulate sort of what China's wanting to do. And then the flip side of that is Vietnam is basically a neighbor of China. So like Vietnam is a large country, a populous country, but it's a small country compared to China, and has to worry about its independence and guard its independence jealously if China is expanding. So if we talk a lot about Taiwan and about South Korea, but like Vietnam is really also another country that is going to feel Chinese expansionism if that's what's going to happen. There are also factions though within Vietnam that like China, that like the model, that would prefer closer ties with China. That kind of want to go the opposite direction. So there's just that was a little bit rambling. I guess the way to think about it is think about Vietnam as having multiple factions within a communist country. Some of those want to be more pro-West and pro-business and just want to make money. And some of those see that, hey, China's a rising power. We need to sort of figure out where we are in this region, and pissing off China or being seen as a U.S. ally is probably not the best thing for us. We probably need to think about reorienting a little bit more towards China. That's like a gross oversimplification, but I think that has to be part of what's going on here.
This is sort of a big question, and feel free to punt if it's too highfalutin for this format. But I'm just listening to what you're saying about Vietnam and how divided it is, north and south, and it just strikes me like it's funny how many Southeast Asian countries are in similar circumstances, whether it's Thailand or, Vietnam or Malaysia, where there's just strongly entrenched and very, different factions that have been in place for a long time. And yet, bigger Northern Asian countries, even China, which is such a huge and diverse place, seems to have a national identity that's stronger than it should be, given how different it is geographically, different in terms of language and food and culture. Is that a fair way to classify things? And if so, do you have any speculation for what could be behind that? Is that a geographic thing, or I have no idea?
That's another good question. I'm not going to punt because I never punt. I got a BA and BS, but I guess the first thing I would say is that all countries have political instability and different factions. Like here in the United States, like we have plenty of this ourselves. So I don't want to make it out like this is unique to them. And you named 3 countries that are actually very, very different. Vietnam, communist country, recovering from a civil war. Malaysia, a bunch of different islands that are sort of vaguely connected by a center and trying to create an identity out of whole cloth. I mean, not quite to the same extent as Indonesia, but very similar sort of dynamics there. Just even look at Malaysia on a map, like it's hard to imagine Malaysia as any kind of modern nation state. It's stitching together this kind of identity. And then Thailand, like still a monarchy, and you still get these clashes between the monarchy and the people and like all these other things. So those are actually like 3 very different cases. I will say this also goes into like a larger conversation about colonialism at different parts of the world that became independent at different points in time. Like China, it had its centuries of humiliation, and certainly, places like Hong Kong were colonized or Macau were colonized, but China was never really conquered or colonized by a European power. It always maintained its own distinctiveness from that point of view. Japan, obviously, I was talking with somebody about this just the other day. Like one of the best things the United States ever did from a policy perspective was not truly conquering Japan from like a political point of view, like even in defeating Japan, keeping the emperor, keeping some of Japan's, distinctiveness to itself. Korea is sort of maybe a more interesting one to compare there. So I think it's probably more about, these Southeast Asian countries were just weaker and had weaker identities relative to some of the ones in the north. And like with Japan, you could say, oh, Japan's an island. Like they were able to become a sort of unified nation over time. China's so huge that nobody was ever going to conquer it. And China itself is sort of a constantly evolving, from the Mings to the who came after the Mings? Why am I blanking there? That's bad. From the Mings to the Qings, and then like all the way through. Like they've and you had Manchus come in, and then the Han Chinese sort of assimilate all of it. Like there's a sense of like defined identity there, and a lot of these places in Southeast Asia that's still developing, and I mean developing in a lot of parts of the emerging in emerging markets across the world. So I don't know if does that do it well enough, or you want to push a little more.
Oh, well, it definitely was not a punt. So I
No,
applaud you,
I never
sir.
punt. I would rather be interesting and wrong, and open about what I don't know than like just be like, oh, I don't know, like who like that. That's boring. Doesn't make for very good podcast content either.
You're like Chat GPT. You'd rather be interesting and wrong and confident.
I guess so, but my confidence is all I talk about. Like my confidence in some ways is it's not a mirage. Like politics, like geopolitics. This is true of markets too. Like the amount of hubris that you have to sort of press pause on like a dynamic process and say, well, this is what this means. Like it takes a lot of arrogance, and you need an equal amount of humility to know that like you're doing something very unnatural, because the moment you say you try to treat like an entity as stopping in time, like it could change tomorrow, it could change next week, it could change 2 minutes after you said it. For all I know, somebody in Vietnam, like 3 minutes after I started talking about it, like won in some kind of power struggle, and everything I said is completely irrelevant. So I think and this goes back to the fox hedgehog thing that we actually talked about, I think last week or the week before. The real problem for people who engage in different methodologies, who are willing to change their mind, is that it's really hard to communicate clear advice or research or analysis when you're willing to change your mind that much, because people will tune in one day and be like, I thought you said that China was falling apart. Now you say, or I thought you said that that Europe was rising. Now you're shorting the euro. It's like, yes, like if you're good at analysis, like that's the sort of thing you have to do. And the real hard part of that is communicating, hey, like yesterday, I felt really good about that position. Today, things changed, and I'm not attached to the previous view just because I said it before. But that's hard, and you also run the risk of, if you change your mind too much, then you just seem like, willy-nilly, silly, all over the place, not actually sticking to your guns at all. So that there's a kernel of sort of truth in what you're saying there, which is I always have to speak with confidence, even when I'm not really confident about something. That's why I always sort of say at the outset, or I try to be really good about saying, hey, about this, I'm very confident. About this other thing, I'm not really confident. But if you just sort of heard me talking about both of them, hopefully I'm giving you like that certainty behind it so that it's in some ways communicable.
Yeah, it's a real challenge with investing too. And I guess this is a good opportunity to reiterate that this podcast is never investment advice. And I know for legal reasons we have to say that, but for real fundamental reasons too, because investing doesn't work like this. And people get this confused where they think investing is telling stories. And oh, I got this right. And oh, I'm going to take a victory lap on this and that. It has nothing to do with it. And if you listen to someone like George Soros, he very famously said, like, the stories don't matter. And what I do is I change my mind all the time, and you explore different theses and that, but that makes for terrible storytelling. Not only the changing the mind, but also the implementation. So we may come out here and say, hey, we're short the euro, but then we have these other two things that kind of hedge it out. And, if it doesn't go right, these other equities that we're in will do better. And the implementation and the storytelling are completely different things, and making money and investing is about implementation 98%, and the ideas and the storytelling is 2%. But no one wants to listen to a podcast about that, so we have to try to take what we're doing and turn it into narratives.
Yeah. Although I think that's exactly right. Well, that's good. So we used China to talk about like market narratives, and we used Vietnam to think about thinking and about investment advice.
Let's use Kazakhstan to talk about epistemology.
Very nice. Borat probably. I don't even know how you would pronounce epistemological in a Borat accent. And I'm pretty proficient at Borat accents. I bet that's a surprise to all of you listeners. Well, where do you want to close, Rob? We could talk a little bit about Peru. We could talk a little bit about Azerbaijan and air cargo. We can leave some of these things to next time. What's the last place you want to hit on the menu?
I would like to know, so we've had on the knowledge platform, you put this thing about Kazakhstan shipping oil to Germany, which I thought was interesting. And also, I know a lot of people are talking about or speculating about a big Russian offensive that they're preparing for when the weather permits, coming through Belarus, or that sort of thing. You might want to address that, because I'm sure people are wondering about it. Is there anything that people should be thinking of in terms of war, in terms of Central Asian countries maneuvering around the war, And, we can talk about the Azerbaijan stuff, I think, in connection with that, because that's really important.
Yeah. So, I mean, picking up on what we just talked about, I have no certainty about the direction that the war is going right now. None. I have scenarios, like I could see a full-scale Russian offensive. I could see a full-scale Ukrainian offensive. I could see a frozen conflict. I could see a truce. I would put the probability at all of them at even, 25%, 25%, like down the board. There's just so much happening that it's really hard to be sure about. I will say this week, I think the West, the Ukrainians won't be happy about, they didn't get everything they wanted in terms of weapons and aid. They're never going to get everything that they wanted. And one of my friends who I was talking to about this thought that the German recalcitrance on providing tanks, and they're not going to do it until the United States does, was wimpy, but they're doing it. They're going to go along eventually. So, the European Union dispatched $3 billion of aid. The first part of a tranche of it's the first tranche of an $18 billion euro package. The United States is going to send them a bunch of combat vehicles and arms and equipment. Britain is talking about sending them tanks. It'd be interesting if I wonder what a Brazilian tank would look like on the Ukrainian-Russian battlefield. France is going to send armored infantry fighting vehicles. Like, the West is showing up to support Ukraine and seems to be at least giving them the things that they need to resist a Russian offensive. Whether that's coming or the Russians just want you to think it's coming, who knows? The Russians also are continuing to bomb Ukrainian cities. They hit an apartment complex in Dnipro this week, and like 45 people died, which is just really depressing. But we don't really know. I think, but it seems to me that the most likely scenario is you're going to get renewed fighting, and that the West seems to be willing to support kind of Ukraine as much as possible going forward to prevent Russia from succeeding. And it's starting to give Ukraine the things that it needs to sort of consider a counteroffensive. But again, I don't think there's a lot of certainty with Russia-Ukraine, and that's why I'm sitting on my hands, I think, with a lot of this stuff. We are seeing, though, with and this is actually another interesting part of it. I should step back and say, as Russia gets more focused on Ukraine, that means it's going to get weaker in Central Asia. It's going to get weaker in the South Caucasus. It's probably going to get weaker in the Balkans too. I'm thinking about that relationship with Serbia. In Central Asia is the flip side of the European mild winter coin. So Europe's having a historically mild winter, and it's driving down natural gas prices there. Central Asia is freezing. All of the stands are facing extremely cold weather. Turkmenistan, which usually exports natural gas, not just to its neighbors, but to China and Iran, has stopped exporting because it's keeping it all in-house because it wants to be able to satisfy domestic demand. So there's sort of a lot of small political signals in Central Asia that things are not going that great. And that's also affecting places like China or like Iran, where you're getting natural gas shortages in some provinces in Iran because they're not getting the natural gas that they're used to getting from Turkmenistan. But there's nothing really sort of happening there on the ground. This ties in, though, to what you were talking about with Kazakhstan. So apparently there's this deal between Germany and Kazakhstan where the Germans are going to import Kazakh oil, but it has to go through Russia. And Russia apparently has approved that. So this is now a second sign. I would say the first was Russia is going to accept foreign currency from unfriendly countries for natural gas exports, that maybe Russia's considering some kind of ability to at least work with its customers in Europe. So maybe they're doing it for leverage. Maybe it's because they're trying to build up to a negotiation. I don't know. But I can't imagine that Germany is dumb enough to think that, hey, we're just going to import from Kazakhstan, no problem, because the Russians are going to be cool with that. That would be really dumb if that's what they're thinking about. But then moving into the South Caucasus, we joked about Nagorno-Karabakh earlier. Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's this disputed region. It's an enclave, right? Nagorno-Karabakh is an enclave with a majority Armenian population that is in southwest Azerbaijan. I think I got that right. And if not, the Azerbaijan and Armenia haters on Twitter are very real, Rob. I don't know if you've ever encountered them. There's some very scary shit on social media if you get on the wrong side of either Armenia or Azerbaijan. But anyway, Azerbaijani protesters have been blocking the main Armenian corridor to access Nagorno-Karabakh for about 2 months now. And Russia came out this week, the foreign ministry came out this week and said, Azerbaijan, we really want you to stop doing that and to get these protesters out of the way. And Azerbaijan said, basically the equivalent of, are you going to make us? You've got 2,000 peacekeepers on the ground. There's illegal mining activities going around. We don't think we need to move at all. no disrespect to Armenia and Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, like that stuff doesn't matter very much. What matters is that Russia is an Armenian ally and Turkey is an Azerbaijani ally. And if you start to get real conflict there, are you going to get the potential for great power conflict between Russia and Turkey? Our eyes have been focused on the Black Sea and the Bosporus for that. But the worse things sort of get between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the more you start to worry that it could drag Russia and Turkey in. Don't think it will. I don't think either Russia or Turkey want that. But sometimes things happen that countries don't want because people on the ground are crazy and want to fight each other.
And what do you think Turkey stands to gain from Russian weakness if they were to openly confront them or just gain at their expense as they sort of withdraw in terms of influence in the region?
Well, I don't think Turkey gains much at all from confrontation. That's why they've played it fairly skillfully, I think, both sides of the Russia-Ukraine war. But in the long term, I mean, Turkey has ambitions to be, the top influencer in Central Asia, to be the top influencer in the Caucasus, to be the top influencer in the Balkans and in the Mediterranean. I mean, this is like the Neo-Ottoman Empire sort of rising. So the more Russia recedes, the more Turkey is going to be one of those countries that fills the gaps. And in between now and then, what Turkey needs to do is not import so much energy and so much food from Russia. So I think one of the things that they're doing is they're pragmatic right now because they understand their economy can't really survive without good relations with Russia right now. But in 4 or 5 years' time, if you start getting, natural gas from the Black Sea and some of these pipelines across the Middle East, if you're able to push a little bit more into the South Caucasus, let's say you can get good relations with Turkmenistan. I mean, like all those things are kind of building towards that larger Turkish, its imperial ambitions. I don't know if you saw that Turkey, President Erdogan is bringing the elections forward, it looks like, by a month. And he had a remarkable quote that I put in the SITREP just a second ago. He said, when asked about the election, he said, 2023 is the beginning of the century of Turkey. That is what makes this upcoming election important and historical. Turkey is at such a crossroads that such opportunities come to nations once in a century. So that's how Erdogan's thinking about elections and the sort of geopolitical moment that Turkey is at. And I'm sure part of that is he's seeing that, Turkey's grand rival in a lot of these places where it wants to expand is really, it's not going well for Russia.
Well, do you want to talk about South America or shall we keep this Eurasia focused?
Let's keep it Eurasia focused. Let's just say very briefly, I mean, if you want to know more about South America, this is a good plug for the Global SITREP, where we're sort of putting things all the time and keeping on top of things. The situation has not gone away in Peru. As of today, like a bunch of protesters are marching on Lima, the capital. They've extended the state of emergency for 30 days. So that situation has not gone away, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. The most likely scenario is probably that the military intervenes and sort of restores some kind of law and order. But yeah, Peru is another one where there's just a lot of uncertainty right now and where things are a little bit out of control. So we're watching very closely, and I think people should continue to watch very closely. I mean, Peru it's remarkable how much it's already been pushed down in the global media narrative. I mean, I really have to dig to find news about Peru right now. We'd rather talk about the debt ceiling and all this other stuff. But, I think it's a pretty big deal that the second largest copper exporter in the world is seething. I did see that the USDA had a impeccably timed report today about why Peru was a good export market for U.S. agricultural goods that they published today or yesterday or something on their website. So good timing to the USDA there. Yikes. They're probably right, by the way. Peru is a good potential export market once they get their shit together.
It's funny. I saw someone criticized us or criticized you on Twitter, and they said, these guys don't know what they're talking about because what would it take to stop copper production in Peru? It's just not realistic. And then I saw on the Knowledge platform this morning, there was, basically an attack on a Glencore mine, and they shut down the mine. So... Yeah. I guess that's what it takes.
Well, and that's even like further afield than I would. I missed that hater raid. I must have blocked that person or muted that person already. I was more worried about blocking the roads. So, and that's what the Peruvian protesters are doing. They're blocking all the roads. So you can continue mining operations all that you want, but if you can't actually get it to a port, like it's not going to go anywhere. But that's cool. I love haterade. I know I'm doing something right if people are yelling at me on social media. So
glad to let you take all the flack. That's for sure.
I've seen a lot worse. Like when your last name is Shapiro and you deign to be a public figure, nasty people come at you on social media. It's fine. It's easy. Well, on that uplifting note, Rob, I'll be in frigid. I guess I'll be in Fargo by this time next week. So if my face hasn't frozen off, I'm growing this beard because I'm trying to stay warm. When I'm in North Dakota next week, it's itching my face terribly. I can't sleep.
Are you going to do the ice fishing, or what's the plan?
I believe we're doing the ice fishing. Yes, that is currently the rough plan, but I don't have it completely locked in yet. But maybe I'll see if I can bring the recording equipment to the ice fishing. Maybe I can 5G hotspot or something. And
well, you should explain these things that they use for the ice fishing, because I certainly didn't know about them until you told me.
I'll explain it. I'll explain it next week because I've only heard the rumors of it, but it sounds like people spend tens of thousands of dollars for these, structures that they use to go ice fishing in, which seems to defeat the point of ice fishing if you can crack open a beer and turn the heat on and watch television while you're doing it. But anyway, I'll report back hopefully next week with my on the ground report about ice fishing material and how to use that from an investment perspective.
Okay. Sounds good.
Right, well, until then, cheers, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.